Okay, today is Lamed Beis Amud Aleph. We're at the very top line at the Mishnah Seder Brachos. We're talking about the order of prayer on Musaf, on Rosh HaShana, because that's the main liturgical statement of Rosh HaShana is in the Musaf prayer. So, Amar Avos Gvuros Kedushas Hashem, you do the regular standard 3 blessings at the beginning of the Amidah, that is 365 days a year, which is, the first bracha is Magen Avraham, which is called Avos, mentioning of the patriarchs. Second bracha is called Gevuras Geshamim, talking about the might of God, and Mechaye Hamesim. And the third bracha is Kedushas Hashem, Ata Kadosh, Baruch Ata Hashem Hakel HaKadosh. And then, V'kolo Malchi Yosimam. Strangely enough, this opinion of the Mishnah says that you should make mention of God's kingship, the fact that He's king, within those first 3 brachas. Now, as we're going to see very clearly, the premise of this Mishnah is that the 3 themes of Rosh Hashanah are Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. Mentioning God's kingship, mentioning that He remembers, and mentioning the shofar. Those 3 have to get into the Amidah. So according to this opinion, you make mention of God's kingship in the first 3 blessings of the Amidah. Ve'eno tokeya. And you don't blow shofar at any of the first 3 brachas. Kedushas hayom v'tokeya. The next bracha number 4, is all about the sanctity of the day. They talk about, just like on Shabbos we talk about Shabbos in the Amidah, so too on Rosh HaShana we talk about the day of being sanctified by Hashem. And then after that bracha there's Tekiya Shofar. Okay? And Zichronos v'tokeya, Shofros v'tokeya. Then the 5th bracha will be Zichronos, and then after that bracha is over you blow the shofar. The 6th bracha is Shofros, and after that bracha is over, you blow the shofar. Va'omer avoda v'hoda u'birkas kohanim. And then you say the last 3 blessings of the Amidah. Again, same as 365 days a year. The Ritzei, hamachzer shechinasa l'tzion. Then modim, hatov shimcha lachan ela odos. And then birkas kohanim and sim shalom, hamivareches amo Yisrael bashalom. Okay? That's according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. This is according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that Malchios does not have its own separate bracha. But Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, Imeno tokeya l'malchios lamahu mazkir. Rabbi Akiva says if you're not blowing the shofar for a separate bracha of malchios, why make mention of it at all? And that's a strange question, so the Gemara is going to address that momentarily. Ella Omer avos u'gvuros u'kedushas Hashem, v'kolo malchios im kedushas hayom v'tokeya. So rather Rabbi Akiva says, and this is what we do, you say the first 3 brachas of the Amidah standard, then the 4th bracha is Malchios, together with the mentioning of the sanctity of the day of Rosh Hashanah. And then after that 4th bracha is over, you blow the shofar. Zichronos v'tokeya, shofars v'tokeya. Then a separate bracha of Zichronos, blowing shofar afterwards. Next, 6th bracha of shofros, and then you blow shofar. And then va'omer avoda v'hoda u'birkas kohanim. And then you say the last 3 blessings of the Amidah as standard. Okay, let's take a look at the Gemara. Okay, the Gemara now says, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, Imeno tokei l'malchios lamahu mazkir. So what does that line in the Mishnah mean that Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Well, if you're not blowing shofar after malchios, why make mention of malchios at all? So the Gemara says, I don't understand what kind of question is that. Lamahu mazkir rachmana amar idkar. The Torah says you have to make mention of malchios and Rosh Hashanah, as we're going to derive shortly. So ela lama eser lema teisha dahol v'ishtani ishtani. But rather, what Rabbi Akiva means is as follows: if you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, see that the bracha of malchios does not deserve its own bracha, therefore it doesn't have the same prominence as zichronos and shofros. If that's the case, then I don't understand why you're giving it the same footing as far as the number of psukim that we mention in the blessing of zichronos and shofros. As we'll see later on, there you have to mention psukim from Tanakh for malchios, zichronos, and shofros. For zichronos and shofros, you have to mention 10 psukim each, and for malchios also you have to have 10 psukim. But according to you, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it should not have necessity for 10 psukim, since it doesn't even merit its own bracha. And therefore, let it only have 9 brachas to show that it's changed, to show that it's downgraded. It's not as important as zichronos and shofros. That's really Rabbi Akiva's challenge to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And therefore, on the basis of that question, he says, no, of course Malchios has its own bracha, and you group it together with the Kedushas Hayom. Tanu Rabbanan, Minayin sha'omrim avos. How do you know? The Bryce now tells us, how do you know that in every Amidah you're supposed to make mention of the patriarchs. Shenemar Havul Hashem B'nei Elim. The famous kapitel Chavtes that we say all the time is that to give to God praise, O you sons of princes, or you sons of mighty ones. So that means that we always have to remind ourselves who we come from. So that's why we make mention of the Avos. Uminayin Shomim Gevuros. How do you know that the second bracha of Shemona Esrei is mentioning God's might? Shenemar Havul Hashem Kavod Va'oz. As it says, give to God glory and strength. So that's talking about God's might. Obviously, the Gemara learns that this kapitel Chavtes is a modeling for us about how we're supposed to pray the Amidah. Uminayin Shomim Kedushos, Shenemar Havul Hashem Kavod Shemo, Ishtachavul Hashem Bahadras Kodesh. And how do you know that the third blessing has to do with God's sanctity? As it says, give praise to God for the glory of His name and bow down to the beauty of His holiness. So you see that holiness is the theme of the next part of that kapitel. Now let's focus specifically on Rosh HaShana. How do you know that you're supposed to make mention of these three themes on Rosh HaShana? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, Shabbason Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh. The Torah says that on Rosh Hashanah it's a day of Sabbath, a remembrance of the blowing, a holy convocation. So how does he learn this pasuk? Shabbason ze kedushas hayom. The word Shabbaton means that you're supposed to make mention in your Amidah of the sanctity of the day. Zichron means Elu Zichronos. That refers to make mentioning of God remembering. Trua Elu Shofros. That refers to make mentioning of the shofar. And Mikra Kodesh, the final phrase of holy convocation, Kodsheu Ba'asiyas Malacha. You should sanctify the day by not doing malacha, that it's a holy day. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, how he learns the pasuk. Armalo Rabbi Akiva mipnei malo noimar Shabboson Shavos Shavo Pasach HaKosov Techila ? Rabbi Akiva challenges Rabbi Eliezer. He says, "What's the most important principle that you've cited from this pasuk? That Rosh Hashanah is a holiday, is a holy day that you can't do work? Well, you had a choice. You could have derived that from the word Shabbaton, which is a day of rest. You could have learned it out from the word Mikra Kodesh, a holy convocation. Why did you derive it from the end of the pasuk if it's the most important derivation? You should have learned it out from the word Shabbaton, and you used the word Shabbaton to talk about mentioning the holiness of the day in the liturgy. So rather, says Rabbi Akiva, Ela Shabboson Kodsheu Ba'asiyas Malacha. Therefore, I switch the first and last. I hold the word Shabbaton is to tell me to sanctify the day by not doing work. Zichron Elu Zichronos. Zichron, like you said, is to make mention of that God remembers. And Trua Elu Shofros. And Trua talks about the shofar. Mikra Kodesh ze Kedushas Hayom. And Mikra Kodesh reminds us that we're supposed to mention the holiness of the day in our liturgy. The only thing that we haven't addressed is how do we know that we're supposed to say Malchios on Rosh Hashanah? That is not based on this pasuk. So that's the Gemara's next question. And Minayin Shomim Malchios, where do we see that you're supposed to say psukim of kingship? So Tanya Rebbe Omer, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Uchesivu B'chodesh HaShvi'i Zu Malchus. So Rebbe says it's based on the smichus, it's based on the adjacency of psukim, because right before the Torah talks about the law in Parshas Emor of Rosh Hashanah, it talks about the need to leave over for the poor the gleanings in the field. Le'ani v'lager ta'azov osam, and then it says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. I am the Lord your God. So why do you have that phrase, I'm the Lord your God? To make it adjacent to Uvachodesh HaShvi, that on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, there shall be a holy convocation. So what do you see from that? That on that holy convocation of Rosh Hashanah, you're supposed to acknowledge that Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I'm the Lord your God, which is another way of saying that you're supposed to acknowledge that God is king. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer Eino Tzarich Harehu Omer v'hayu lachem lezikaron lifnei Elokeichem, that he says, I have another source. You don't learn it out from the pasuk by Rosh Hashanah, but rather you learn it out from what we just learned in Parshas Baloscha this last Shabbos about the Chatzotzros. The Torah says you should have trumpets, and they shall be for you for a memory before your God, that God will remember you. She'ein tamul omer ani Hashem Elokeichem. There's no reason that the end of the pasuk should say by the Chatzotzros that I'm the Lord your God. Umat tamul omer ani Hashem Elokeichem ze bana'av l'chol makom shenamar b'zichronos yu malchios imahin. This teaches me that any time that the Torah talks about a blast which will cause remembrance before God, it has to be accompanied with Ani Hashem Elokeichem, a mentioning of God's kingship. And that's how we know that on Rosh Hashanah, since we're going to be talking about Zichronos, we also have to be talking about Malchios. V'heichan Omra, l'kedushas hayom. And where do you say it? As Rabbi Akiva had argued, according to this brisa, this goes like Rabbi Akiva. You put it in with the kedushas hayom, with the mentioning of the holiness of the day. So Tanya, Rabbi Omer imam malchios omra. Rebbe says the same thing as Rabbi Akiva, that you combine it with the Kedushas Hayom. Ma matzinu b'chol makom b'revius, afkan b'revius. And what's my reasoning? Why do you combine Malchios together with Kedushas Hayom? Because just like on Shabbos and Yantif, which bracha of the Amida makes mention of the holiness of the day? It's always the fourth bracha. You have the first three, which is the standard first three opening part of the Amida, and then you launch into Shabbos, or you launch into Yantif. Well, the same thing is here. You're supposed to launch into the Kedushas Hayom of Rosh HaShana. And since that fourth bracha is Malchios, they go together. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Ima Zichronos Omra, Ma Matzinu B'chol Makom Be'emsa, Avkan Be'emsa. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees. He says that Kedushas Hayom is supposed to be in the fifth bracha with Zichronos, not with Malchios. And what's his reasoning? He says, look, a standard Amida for Musaf on Shabbos or Yantif has 7 blessings. 3 at the beginning, 3 at the end, and 1 in the middle. On Rosh Hashanah, you've got 3 at the beginning, 3 at the end, and how many in the middle? 3 in the middle. You've got it's a 9 blessing Amida for Rosh Hashanah Musaf. So he says, if during Shabbos and Yantav for the rest of the year, the Kedushas Hayom bracha goes right in the middle, is the middle bracha, so too the Kedushas Hayom bracha should be the middle bracha. What's the middle bracha of a 9 blessing Amida? It's the 5th bracha, not the 4th bracha, and therefore he argues that Kedushas Hayom should be in Zichronos, not in Malchios. Now, the Brisa continues and tells us, V'cheshekidshu based in Esashana Be'usha, Yorad Reb Yochanan ben Baroka lifnei Reb Shimon Gamliel v'asek Reb Yochanan ben Nuri. This is really going back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had told us that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Reb Yochanan ben Nuri, whether Malchios gets its own bracha together with Kedushas Hayom, or whether it is combined with the first 3 blessings of the Amida. And apparently, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka was in Usha, which is where the Sanhedrin was at some later date, and he was leading the davening in front of Shimon Gamliel, he went like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. He said the psukim of Malchios at the beginning of the Amida, and did not reserve a separate bracha for Malchios. And Amar lo Rabbi Shimon lo hayanogen kain b'Yavne. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel protested. He said, that's not the way we used to do it in Yavne, where the previous Sanhedrin presided. So Liyom Hasheni, the next day, Yorad Rabbi Chanina ben Osher Rabbi Yossi Haglili v'Osaka Rabbi Akiva. Then Rabbi Chanina went ahead and led the davening. He led the Musaf. He was the Baal Tefillah. And he went like Rabbi Akiva, where he gave Malchios its own blessing. So Amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Kach hayanogen b'Yavne. That's the way we used to do it in Yavne. That's the proper way. Chaim, right. So the Gemara now says, L'meimer de Rabbi Shimon Gamliel ka Rabbi Akiva svirale. How can you tell me that Rabbi Akiva goes like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, or Rabbi Shimon goes like Rabbi Akiva? V'ha'amar Rabbi Akiva Malchios im Kedushas Hayom. But Rabbi Akiva had said that you're supposed to combine Malchios with Kedushas Hayom, and Shimon Gamliel said you're supposed to combine Kedushas Hayom in Zichronos in the 5th bracha. So how does that work? They're not consistent. How could Rabbi Shimon Gamliel give his stamp of approval to Rabbi Akiva's minhag if he argues with Rabbi Akiva? So Amar Lahu, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Kedushas Hayom im Zichronos, because Hayom Amar Lahu, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Amar Lahu, that's the machlokas. So that's the sole part of the question. So the Gemara's answer is Amar Reb Zera Lomar Shetokin Lamalchios Liyom Shetokin Lamalchios. So Reb Zera says it's not that Rabbi Chanina put Malchios together with Kedushas Hayom. The point that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was endorsing, and he says that's what we did in Yavna, was that he had given Malchios its own separate bracha, and they blew shofar after Malchios. Whether or not they put Kedushas Hayom with Malchios or Kedushas Hayom with Zichronos was not the point that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was endorsing. He taka held that the Kedushas Hayom was supposed to be inserted in Zichronos. What he was endorsing is the fact that Malchios got its own separate bracha, like Rabbi Akiva said in our Mishnah, not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and therefore they blew shofar after Malchios. That's what he endorsed. Now, let's go back to that story. Liyom Hasheni Yord Rabbi Chanina. So the next day, Rabbi Chanina went and led the davening. So, my Sheni, what does it mean the next day? So, Ilema Yom Tov Sheni Lamemer Davru La'elul, Maybe there was a 2-day Rosh HaShana that year. You mean to tell me that they made Elul 30 days and they made Rosh HaShana the following day, so therefore it was a 2-day Yontif? The Ha'amar Rabbi Chanina bar Kahana, Miyamos Ezra Va'elach lo matzinu ela me'ubar. But didn't Rabbi Chanina bar Kahana say in the name of Rav that we've never had a 30-day Elul, almost never, since the times of Elul? And there was never a need to have a 2-day Rosh Hashanah when we were Makadesh al Pi Hariyah, when we sanctified the new moon using witnesses. So how could you tell me that this event took place on a 2-day Rosh Hashanah? There never was a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, certainly not during this period. So Amar Rav Chizda, Mai Sheni, L'Shana Haba'ah. So Rav Chizda says, no, it doesn't mean the next day, it was the 2nd day Rosh Hashanah, but it rather means the next day, meaning the next year, the next Rosh Hashanah. The following year, Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Chanina davened in for the Yamud on the 1-day Rosh Hashanah, and that's where Rav Shem Gamliel says, that's the way we did it in Yavne. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ein pochesin me'asara malchios, me'asara zichronos, me'asara shofros. That you may not have less than 10 verses from Tanakh for each one of the 3 blessings, for malchios, zichronos, and shofros. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, by the way, if you go into your machzor and you count each bracha, you'll see that there are exactly 10 psukim for each one of the blessings of Malchios, Zichronos, and Shofros. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Im Omer Gimel Gimel Mikulan Yatze. If you say 3 of each, then you're Yotze. That's an ambiguous statement. The Gemara is going to clarify what he means. So, Hani Asara Malchios Keneged Mi. So, first of all, why 10? What's the significance of the number 10? So, Amar, what's this? Rabbi Levi. Keneged Asara Hilulim Shamar David B'Sefer Tehillim. It's the 10 praises of song that King David said in the book of Tehillim. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? He only said 10? Hilulim Tuva Havu. There's much more than that in Sefer Tehillim. So Hanach Tichsiv Behu Halaluhu B'Seika Shofar. No, it's the last kapitel of Tehillim, kapitel Kuf Nun, which we say every day. Halaluhu B'Seika Shofar, Halaluhu B'Nevel B'Chinar. It says the word Halaluhu 10 times in that kapitel because it's talking about the shofar. So that was our cue that we're supposed to use the pattern of 10 when on the day of the shofar. Rav Yosef Amar Keneged Aseres Hadibros Shenemar Lo Moshe B'Sinai. Rav Yosef says it corresponds to the 10 commandments because, like Rashi says, Vayhi Kol HaShofar, that was the sound of a shofar by the Aseres Hadibros, and therefore that's our cue. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar Keneged Asara Ma'amora Sheben Nivra Ha'olam. Rabbi Yochanan says it corresponds to the 10 utterances that God made to create the world. We know this from Pirkei Avos as well, that Basara Ma'amoros Nivra Ha'olam, the world was created with 10 utterances of God. So the connection to Rosh Hashanah is because this is the day of creation, right? So the Gemara now says, hey Ninu, what are the 10 utterances? Where do you find that in the Chumash? Vayomer de Bereshis, Vayomer de Bereshis. So the Gemara says that 10 times it says Vayomer Elokim in the first chapter of Genesis. Those are the 10 utterances with which God created the world. So the Gemara says Tesavu. There's not 10, there's 9. Count them. You'll see that there's 9. I challenge you to count them and tell me if you count 9. Because actually there are 10. But anyway, we'll assume the Gemara is correct that there are only 9. Okay? So the Gemara says, Bereshis nami mamar. The answer is that Bereshis is also a mimer. Is also, in other words, implicit in the words Bereshis bar Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz are the words Vayomer Elokim yehi shamayim va'aretz, and then Vayehi shamayim va'aretz. Bereshis bar Elokim is tantamount to saying that God first said, "Let there be heaven and earth," and there was heaven and earth. So it's not written; it's implicit. Tichsiv b'dvar Hashem shamayim nasu, as it says, through the word of God, heaven was created. So the question then, of course, is why then Taka does not the Torah say Vayomer Elokim over there? Good question. You think about that. Let's go weiter. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Im Omer Shalosh Shalosh Mikulan Yatza. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that if you do 3 for each one, that's enough to be Yotze. B'di'evet, that's enough, he says. You don't need 10, 3 is enough, B'di'evet at least. So, Ibayilu, Heichi Katani Shalosh, Min HaTorah, Heichi Katani, Shalosh Min HaTorah, Shalosh Min Ivin, Shalosh Min HaKsuvim, Dahabutei Shavik B'nei Ochada. So one way of interpreting Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is that he's not really that much in argument with the Chachamim. The Chachamim say you need 10, and he says you need 3 of each. So what does 3 of each mean? It could mean 3 for each bracha, or it could mean 3 of each type of Tanakh, of each type of biblical text, for each bracha, which means you'd need 3 psukim from Chumash, 3 psukim from Navi, and 3 psukim from Ksuvim. In which case, he holds that you need 9 verses for each bracha, and therefore the only difference between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is that the Chacham say you need 10, and he says you need 9 for each bracha. O dilma echad min haTorah v'echad min Navim v'echad min Ksuvim davin lu shalosh v'ika beinayu tuva. Or maybe maybe Rabbi Yochanan is being much more lenient, and he's saying that whereas the Chachamim require 10, I only require 1 from Chumash, 1 from Navi, and 1 from Ksuvim for a total of 3 per bracha. So the difference is 7. They say 10 and I say 3. So which one is this? Is it 10 verses 9 or 10 verses 3? That's the question. Tashma, the Tanya, ein pochasin me asara malchios, me asara zichronos, me asara shofros. Let's look at the Brisa. It says that you may not have less than 10 malchios, 10 zichronos, 10 psukim of shofros. V'im omar sheva mikulon yatsa keneged shiva rikim. And according to this Brisa, if b'di'evid you only had 7 per bracha, then b'di'evid you're yotze, because 7 is also a significant number to correspond to the 7 heavens. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, and here's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri again. Now remember, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in our Mishnah is coming to diminish the amount. He's not coming to be more machmer, he's coming to be more lenient, to say that if you have less than what the Tanna Kama says, you're also going to be yotze. He says, "Hapoches lo yivchos misheva v'im amar shalosh mikulan yatsa kenegator navim ukesuvim." I'm sorry. So amar shalosh mikulan yatsa. He says that if you're going to have less than 10, then as long as you have 7 of each, you're yotze. And if if you're going to do less than 10, don't do less than 7 lechatchila. And if you only did 3 of each, you're going to be yotze. So now the question is, what does he mean by 3 of each? 3 of Torah, 3 of Navi, and 3 of Ksuvim? That's 9. So then what is 7? He says if you're going to do less than 10, do at least 7. So what does that mean? 7 of Navi, 7 of Ksuvim, and 7 of Torah? That means you're going to have 21. So he's not being makel, he's being machmir, because the Tanna Kama holds you need only 10. What is he going to say? You need 21? That's not mashma that he's coming to be machmir. So therefore we conclude that when he says you need 3 of each, it's 3 per bracha, not 3 per Torah, 3 per Nevi'im, 3 per Ksuvim. So it's 10 verses 3, not 10 verses 9. QED. So now the Gemara says, what does this number 3 correspond to? Keneged Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. It corresponds to the 3 parts of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim. V'amrila keneged Kohanim, Levim, v'Yisraelim. Some say that the significance of 3 is that it corresponds to Kohanim, Levim, and Yisraelim. So obviously, anytime the Gemara talks about the number 3, it gets a little nervous, right? Because you got to make sure that it's not having to do with any other religion, right? So you got to make sure that it corresponds to something that's of significance within Judaism. So Amar Rav Huna, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and he says the halacha at least b'di'evet is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, which means that if you did less than 10, as long as you had at least 3 psukim for each of the 3 brachos, so then you're going to be yotze b'di'evet. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ein maskirin malchios zichronos v'shofar shel puranus. That even though we mentioned that you need to have psukim mentioned in each bracha of malchios, zichronos, and shofros, you're not allowed to make mention of psukim that discuss retribution against the Jewish people. You have to make sure that they have a nice theme that will put the Jewish people in a positive light. And we'll give examples of this. Maskil b'Torah mashlim b'Navi. You start psukim from the Chumash, and then you go to Ksuvim, and then you finish with psukim from the Navi. Why finish with psukim from the Navi? So it's very interesting. It sounds almost like the Mishnah is suggesting that Kesuvim has a higher sanctity than the psukim from Navi, and there are Rishonim that actually state that explicitly, that the book of the Kesuvim has a higher sanctity than the Navi. So start with Torah, then go to Kesuvim, and then finish with the Nevi'im. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, im hishlim batorah yatsa, Rabbi Yossi says, if you finished with a pasuk from Chumash, you're also yotze. Let's see what that means also. So Gemara now says, Malchios, what's an example of a pasuk of retribution having to do with God's kingship? Kigon, the pasuk in Yechezkel says, Chai oni nu'um Hashem Elokim im lo bi'ar chazaka u'vizro netuya u'vechema shafucha em lo chaleim. God swears that I'm going to rule over you with an iron fist and with great anger. So you don't want to mention that pasuk. He says, "Va'achol gav domer Rav Nachman kol ki hayrischa lirsach kudshabrichu alan leveliferu kinon." He says, even though Rav Nachman said that halavai, that Hashem should be our king, even if he's angry with us. We'd rather have him as our king in Eretz Yisrael instead of having to live outside in Golus without God being directly over us. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, since it mentions God's anger, it's not appropriate to invoke a mentioning of God's anger on Rosh Hashanah. We don't want God to be upset with us on Rosh Hashanah. We want a positive judgment. So therefore, it's true that I'd rather have an angry God as my king than have no God, but it's not something that you want to mention on Rosh Hashanah. Zikaron, Keneged, what's an example of a retribution pasuk having to do with God's memory? Kegon vayizkor ki basar hema, that God remembers that man is a flawed, mortal being, right? Just mortal flesh. That's also not something that you want to make mention of on Rosh Hashanah. Shofar Kegon, Tiku Shofar begiva v'goymer, blow the shofar and give a reminiscent of the civil war that took place in Sefer Shoftim about the Pilegish begiva. You don't want to make mention of the Jewish people's sins. However, the Brisa adds that if you want to make mention of a retribution pasuk having to do with retribution not against the Jewish people, but against other nations, that's perfectly fair game, because that actually is a positive for the Jewish people. In other words, it's negative against the enemies of the Jewish people, so that adds up to a positive for Klal Yisrael. Malchus kagon Hashem malach yirgazu amim. Like, for example, if you want to mention that God is king in the context of bringing retribution upon the goyim, it says yirgazu amim. The other nations will tremble or they'll be upset because of God's retribution power. Like it says, God is king forever, and the nations will be lost from his land. And Zikaron, like what's an example of a retribution against the other nations having to do with God's memory? Kegon Zechor Hashem livnei Edom, Eis Yom Yerushalayim. God, remember the day against the Edomites who tried to raze Raze, Jerusalem, to the ground. So therefore, again, calling upon, invoking God to remember to bring retribution against our enemies. Shofar kegon v'Hashem Elokim b'shofar yiska v'halach b'saros teman. An example of a shofar having to do with retribution of the other nations is that God will blow the shofar and go to the storms of Yemen and bring retribution upon those nations. V'chesiv Hashem tzivakos yagen aleim. And it says, because it says right afterwards that the Lord of hosts will protect the Jewish people from the retribution or from the from their enemies. V'yachlu v'chavshu avnei kela v'shasu chamo v'hamu kamo yain u'malu b'mizrak v'giva kizavayos mizbeach. I think that what that pasuk, it's a pasuk in Zechariah talking about the retribution of the other nations. Okay. Ein maskirin zikaron shel yachid v'afilu l'tova. Kegon zachrenu Hashem b'rtzon hamecha, u'kegon zachor li Elokai l'tova. So another rule that is brought in this brisa is that even though zichronos are a good thing, but you cannot use a pasuk that talks about personal remembrance. That you can't say like a pasuk in Tehillim where King David says, "God remember me for the good," or "God remember b'rtzon hamecha for the sake of wanting your nation, remember me." So, pikdonos harehin kizichronos. And another rule is that anytime the verb pakad is used, that's tantamount to remembering. Because like Vashem kagon Vashem pakad es Sarah, like God remembered Sarah. It doesn't, when it says God visits Sarah, it doesn't, what it means is God invokes a memory of the promise that he had made that Sarah would become fertile. So therefore, that's the word pakad is tantamount to zichronos. So you can use, that's fair game to use as one of the 10 psukim of zichronos. V'chegon pakod pakadati eschem, divrei Rabbi Yossi. Another example is when God says to Moshe, "I have come to visit you to take you out of Egypt." So that's an example of the word pakad is the same thing as zachar. That's according to Rabbi Yossi. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Einon kizichronos. He disagrees. He says you need the actual verb of zachar in order for it to be fair game for the bracha of zichronos. So now the Gemara asks, "Lo Rabbi Yossi nihi nami de pikdonos arein kizichronos, but Vashem pakad esara pikadon de yachidu." The Gemara says, I don't understand. Rabbi Yossi's shita is that the verb pakad is fair game for zichronos. But what about the previous rule, which is that if it's talking about the remembrance of an individual, then you're not supposed to use that. The pasuk of Hashem pakad Sarah was a very personal, individual remembrance that God had of Sarah. So why are you allowed to use that pasuk? So the Gemara answer is, Kevin da asu rabim mina ki rabim damya. The answer is she's the matriarch of all the Jewish people. So since God's remembering of her didn't just affect her, but affected all of Klal Yisrael, all future Jewish generations, so therefore God's remembrance of her was tantamount to God remembering the entire nation of Israel. Next, now the next part, I want you to look at these psukim and tell me how many times you count the word melech in the following two psukim, which we're very familiar with. Su'u sharim rashechem v'hinasu pischei olam v'yavo melech hakavod. Mize melech hakavod. Hashem izuz v'gibor, Hashem gibor milchama. So that's pasuk number 1. How many melechs did you count?
2.
Okay, let's count the melechs in the next pasuk. Su'u sharim rashechem u'su'u pischei olam v'yavo melech hakavod. Mihu ze melech hakavod, Hashem tzavakos hu melech hakavod selah. How many did you count there? 3. So you counted 2 in the first pasuk, 3 in the second pasuk. So Rishona Shtayim Shniya Shalosh Diva Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi correctly says, I count 2 melechs in the first pasuk, 3 melechs in the second pasuk. So if you want to dispense with 5 out of your 10 malchios psukim, you just say these 2 psukim and you're covered. Fantastic. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rishona Echa Shniya Shtayim. Rabbi Yehuda is more machmir. He says no. The question of Mizeh Melech HaKavod, you can't count, because it's a question. It's not an affirmation. It's you're asking, where is the king? So you can't use that as one of the invocations of Malchus. So you have to, so he says the first pasuk only has 1 melech, the second pasuk has 2 melechs, right? Okay, Zamru Elokim Zameru, Zamru Limalkenu Zameru, Ki Melech Kol Haaretz Elokim. How many words melech did you find in that? Zamru Elokim Zameru, Zamru L'Malkeinu Zameru, Ki Melech Kol Haaretz Elokim. 2. There's Malkeinu and Melech, right? So that's Shtaim, Div Rabbi Yossi. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Echos. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, in that pasuk, there's only 1. So why is there only 1 over there? So Rashi explains, is that the first time it's Malkeinu, our king. He's not the king over all the earth. And on Rosh HaShana, you have to affirm that God is king over the entire world, not just over the Jewish people. So therefore, Melech, it's got to be a special Melech. B'shavin b'malach Elokim al goyim, Elokim yashav al kisei kadsho, shehi echas. Everyone agrees that the next pasuk, which talks about God being the king over all the nations and God sitting on his holy throne, that it only counts as 1. In other words, because the word melech is only mentioned once, it's only 1 malchus. Don't think that if we talk about God sitting on his throne, that counts as another malchus. It doesn't. Zikaron sheyesh bo trua. Now, what about what's the rule if you have the word zachar in the context of trua? So you could go either for shofros or go for zichronos. Which one is it? Could go on Shabbos on zichron trua mikra kodesh, like that pasuk about Rosh HaShana. So Omra ima zichronos, Omra ima shofros div Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says you can go either way. You can use that as one of the 10 for zichronos or one of the 10 for shofros. Take your pick. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ena Omra eli ma zichronos bilvad. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says no, that pasuk does not mention shofar. It only mentions the word trua. So that's not fair game for the shofros psukim. You can only use it for zichronos. Malchus sheishimo trua kegon Hashem elokav imo usruas melech bo omer ima malchios omer ima shofros divrei Rabbi Yossi. Similarly, Rabbi Yossi says if you have a pasuk that talks both about malchus and trua, like the pasuk in Parshas Balak, which says that God is with him and the blowing of the king is in him, so you can say that either with malchios or say it with shofros. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer ena omer elim malchios bilvad. And Rabbi Yehuda consistently says, no, since there's no mention of shofar in that pasuk, it's only a malchius pasuk, it's not a shofros pasuk. Trua she'eni malo klum kegon yom trua yelochem omer mashofar stiv Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yehuda Omer eno omer kol iker. And finally, if you have a pasuk that just mentions trua, but doesn't mention the shofar, Rabbi Yossi says that's fair game for shofros. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it doesn't mention shofar, so you can't use it in the psukim for shofars. Next, maskil b'torah umashlim b'navi Rabbi Yossi Omer Hishlam b'Torah Yatsa. So remember, the last part of the Mishnah is that you start with psukim from Torah, then you go to Ksuvim, and then you go to Nevi'im. And Rabbi Yossi says if you finish with a pasuk from Chumash, you're also Yotzei. Im Hishlam di'evid in lechatchila lo. It sounds like that's only b'di'evid, that if you did finish with a pasuk from Chumash, you're Yotzei, but that's not optimal. Ve-chatima Rabbi Yossi Omer hamashlim b'Torah Raizel meshubach. But Rabbi Yossi is quoted as saying that that's actually praiseworthy. That's the lechatchila way to do it. So the Gemara says, Ema mashlim. So you're right. Read the Mishnah as that Rabbi Yossi says you're supposed to be mashlim with the pasuk from Chumash. V'ha im hishlim kitani. But that's not what it says in the Mishnah. Di'evid in lechatchila lo. It's only mashma b'di'evid. So hachi kamer maschil b'Torah u'mashlim b'navi. And Rabbi Yossi Omer mashlim b'Torah v'im hishlim b'navi yatsa. So you have to modify the language. The word hishlim definitely implies b'di'evid. But what Rabbi Yossi really meant to say is, lichatchila, you should finish from a pasuk from Chumash. And if b'di'evid you finish with a pasuk from Navi, you're Yotzei. His b'di'evid was going on finishing with a pasuk from Navi, not finishing with a pasuk from Chumash. Tanya no mihachi, Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, vasiken hoyu mashlimin osa b'Torah. That they wanted to finish it with something chashuv, so the elders used to finish each set of bracha, each set of psukim per bracha with a pasuk from Chumash. So now the Gemara says, Bishlam zichronos v'shofros ikatuva. So the Gemara says, I could understand how it's easy to find plenty of psukim in the Chumash about God remembering. There are plenty of psukim in the Chumash about the blowing of the shofar. However, elamalchios tlasu dahavin, but I only count 3 psukim in the Chumash that have any mention of God being king. So it says, like, for example, Hashem Elokav imo, Usruas Melech bo, Vahi Bishurn Melech, and Hashem Yimloch Li'olam Vayed. Those are the only 3 times that I find God being mentioned as king in the entire Chumash. These 3, one from Parshas Balak, one from Parshas Bezos HaBracha, Vahi Bishurn Melech, that in Jeshurun, in Israel, there is a king, and Hashem Yimloch Li'olam Vayed, in Az Yashir. So where are you going to get the 4th pasuk? If you're supposed to finish with a pasuk from Chumash, that means you're supposed to have 4 psukim from Chumash, the first 3 plus the final, the 10th. So where are you going to get Va'anan Ba'inan Eser? You need a 10th one. So where are you going to get that 10th one from? V'leka. So Amar Rav Huna Tashma Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Malchus Divrei Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion, which is how we paskin, that the last pasuk of Malchios is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, even though the word Melech is not mentioned. But by saying that God is the only unitary being that rules over the universe, that's tantamount to saying that He's the Melech. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Malchus. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, no, that's not Malchus. What's Rabbi Yehuda going to use for the 4th pasuk? Apparently, he doesn't agree with Rabbi Yossi that you finish with a pasuk from Chumash. He'll have to find another pasuk from Nach and not from Chumash. Now, v'yadata hayom v'hashevasa Elohavecha ki Hashem hu ha'elokim ein od Malchus divrei Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Malchus. Similarly, the pasuk of that you shall know and you shall restore to your heart that God is the God and there is none other like Him. That Rabbi Yossi is the same thing as saying Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's a pasuk of Malchus. And Rabbi Yehuda says no. If it ain't got the word Melech, it ain't Malchus. Next, Ata Raizel Adaski Hashem Hu Elokim Ein Od Milavado. Also, similarly, the pasuk which says that there's no other than God. So that's Malchus. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Malchus. And the same machlokas. Rabbi Yossi says if the bottom line is that there's none other than God, that's tantamount to saying that He's the Melech. And Rabbi Yehuda says if it ain't got the word Melech, right, then that's not going to fly. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. We'll just finish to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Over lifnei hateva b'yom tov shel Rosh HaShana, hasheni maskia ubishas halal harishon mekarias halal." We have 2 people that lead the davening on Rosh HaShana. One is the Bal Tefillah for Shacharis, and one is the Bal Tefillah for Musaf. So on Rosh HaShana, who leads the Tekiah Shofar? The Bal Tefillah for Musaf. On days when you say Hallel, who leads the Hallel? The Bal Tefillah for Shacharis. So that's the distinction that the Gemara is making. So the Gemara now says, Maishna Sheni Maskia Mishum Debarovam Hadras Melech. What's the reason why the Bal Musaf should have Tekiah Shofar? Because the more people, the more glory to the king. And since there are more people that come to Shul for Musaf, see, times have not changed for thousands of years. People come late to Shul. And they're actually takanas, just like this. You see that since there are more people in Shul for Musaf, That's why you want the Bal Musaf to lead Tekiya Shofar. But the Gemara says, if that's the argument, Ihachi Halal Nami Nema Bisheni Mishum Debarova Madrus Melech. Well, if that's the argument, then why don't we say Halal and Musaf also to have more people there? So Ela Maishna Halal Debarishon Mishum Desrizin Makdim and Lemitzvahs. But Tekiya Nami Navid Barishon Mishum Desrizin Makdim and Lemitzvahs. So the Gemara's conclusion is, so what's the reason to have Halal at Shacharis? Because there's another compelling argument that's opposite, which is reason Makdim and Lemitzvahs. That the more quick you are to act, the better it is, the better the mitzvah. So if that's the case, do it at Shacharis, do it as early as possible. Well, if that's the argument, then do Tekiya Shofar at Shacharis also. So Amar Rabbi Yechanan Bishas Gzeras Malchus Shana. So the answer is, you're right. It really is totally inconsistent. The only thing you can come up with is that Tekiya Shofar was instituted at a time when there was religious persecution. That the authorities did not want us to blow shofar in the morning during the first 6 hours of the day when they thought that our prayers were being said. So we had to delay Tekiya Shofar until the afternoon, and that's why eventually, for all of posterity, Tekiya Shofar was inserted into Musaf instead. Now, mitkama b'shas halal michlal de Rosh HaShana leka halal. The language of the Mishnah implies that there are either two types of holy days, either days like Rosh HaShana when you blow the shofar, or days where you say Halal, but you don't have Rosh HaShana as a day of Halal. You don't say Halal on Rosh HaShana. So my time, why don't we say Halal on Rosh HaShana? So Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar Malachei Asharis Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the angels say before God, Ribono Shalom, Mepnei Ma in Yisrael Omrim Shir Lefanecha beRosh HaShana v'Yom HaKippurim. Why don't the Jews say Halal before you on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? So the famous answer, Amar Lahem, Efshar Melech Yoshev Al Kisei Din B'Sifrei Chaim B'Sifrei Mesim Pesuchim Lefanov v'Yisrael Omrim Shira? Question mark. God says, how can it be? I'm the king sitting on my throne of judgment. The books of the living and the books of the dead are open before me. The Jewish people are in a state of complete trepidation and fear. You expect them to say shir on a day like that? Their awe overrides their ability to sing with glee, with joy to Hashem, and that's why they don't say Halal on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. You have a wonderful day.